there was a woman who bought a pet snake. It was a 12-foot-long Burmese python. She lived alone in a small house with her young son and kept the snake in a tank in the living room. The pet snake had a habit of escaping from its tank. After a while, the woman began to feel guilty about keeping such a large reptile in such a small, confined space. She would often take the snake out of its tank and allow it to roam freely about the house. Her little son loved the pet snake and often brought it out in the garden to play with it. One morning, the woman noticed that the pet snake had stopped eating. 3 days passed, and the snake still hadn't touched any of its food. The woman began to get worried that there was something wrong with the snake, so she picked up the phone and called the vet. "Is it normal for a snake to suddenly stop eating?" she asked. "It depends," said the vet. "In the wild, snakes often have to survive for long periods without food. Sometimes, they starve themselves in preparation for a big meal. Pet snakes can also get bored with what you're feeding them. They like a change of food now and then." The woman took the vet's advice and bought a new type of food for her pet, but the snake still refused to eat anything. Not long afterwards, the woman woke up in the middle of the night to find her pet snake lying in bed beside her. It was sleeping stretched out completely straight on the bed. Thinking this was a little strange, she picked it up and put it back in the tank. A few days later, her son was playing with the snake in the garden. The woman was washing dishes in the kitchen when she happened to glance out the window. Her son was lying down on the grass. The snake was lying next to him, stretched out and stiff as a board. The woman became convinced that the snake was dying. She immediately grabbed the phone to call the vet again. "My pet snake still isn't eating," she said. "I don't think there's anything to worry about," replied the vet. "Just keep an eye on it, and if it still isn't eating by the end of the month, bring it into my office." "There's something else," said the woman. "The other night, I found it lying in bed beside me. It was stretched out straight and totally rigid." "Oh no," said the vet with alarm. "You'll have to get rid of the snake as soon as possible. It will have to be put down." "Why? What's wrong with it?" asked the woman. "That's what snakes do when they're measuring you," he said. "Measuring me?" she asked. "It was sizing you up in order to eat you," he replied. The horrified woman turned and looked out the window just in time to see her little son's feet disappearing down the snake's throat. When I was young, my parents rented a cabin in the woods. We would go there on weekends to spend some time in the wilderness. My brothers and I loved to explore. There was a dirt road that ran past the cabin, and at the end of the road, there was a small graveyard. It was surrounded by a wrought iron fence with spikes on the top. The gate was locked with a rusty chain and padlock, but we were able to pull the bars apart and squeeze through. The gravestones were very old and worn. On top of one of the graves, there was a smooth black stone. It looked like onyx, and when we were leaving, my older brother took it and put it in his pocket. That night, we were sleeping in the cabin. My parents slept in the bedroom, and my brothers and I slept in the living room. All of a sudden, in the middle of the night, we heard a loud banging at the front door. Bang, bang, bang. We were scared out of our wits. Bang, bang, bang. The door was shaking. It sounded like someone was trying to knock it off the hinges. My dad emerged from the bedroom and asked what was going on. When he saw the looks on our faces, he knew we had no idea. Bang, bang, bang. My dad grabbed an axe and walked over to the door. He looked just as scared as we were. He raised the axe and opened the door, but there was nothing out there. The banging had stopped, and the night was black and silent. After we calmed down, we went back to bed, but none of us were able to get much sleep. The next day, when we went back to the graveyard, the smooth black stone that my brother had taken was sitting on top of the same grave. As soon as we saw that, we ran away and never went back. There were two men who owned a cabin in the woods. Their names were Barry and Conklin. Every winter, they would go up there hunting deer, bear and coyote. They spent weeks up there in the cabin, just the two of them, and everybody assumed they were the best of friends. One day, Conklin came down out of the woods alone. He said his friend Barry had gotten lost out there in the wilderness. A search party was sent back up into the woods to find him, but there was a snowstorm and they couldn't find any trace of the missing man. The police thought there was something fishy about the whole business. Conklin got very nervous fluster when they began asking him questions, and they suspected he wasn't telling them the whole story. However, they didn't have any evidence against him. They didn't even have a dead body to prove a murder had actually been committed, so they had to let him go. Then, the spring came and the snow melted. A hunter came across a corpse lying at the base of a tree. It was Barry, and his skull had been bashed in. Still, the police couldn't prove anything. He could have fallen and hit his head. He could have been killed by a bear. After an autopsy, the coroner listed his death as being from cause or causes unknown. Beside his corpse, they found his rifle, which was all rusty. Strapped to his leg was a sheath for his hunting knife, but the knife itself was missing. Nobody thought much about that at the time. The next winter, it was hunting season again, and Conklin went back up to the cabin. This time, he had a new friend with him, a man named Newcomb. It was a long hike, and when they reached the cabin, Newcomb decided to go to bed early. In the middle of the night, he was awakened from a deep sleep by the sound of a man screaming. It sounded like Conklin's voice, and he was screaming, "Don't do it! Don't do it!" Newcomb jumped out of bed and felt round for a flashlight. When he switched it on, his eyes were greeted by a horrible sight. There was Conklin, sitting in his chair. Blood was pouring down into his lap and forming a pool on the floor. His eyes were wide open and his face was twisted in a grimace of abject horror. The one thing that puzzled the police was what they found when they examined the hunting knife. There was only one set of fingerprints on the handle, and the man they belonged to had been dead for a year. They belonged to Barry.